Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. All right, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Drew Podcast. My name is Avery, and we are on episode 6, and today we're going to be discussing the 4th Nancy Drew book, The Mystery at Lilac Inn. Now, I did want to start this podcast off by saying I know that next Thursday is actually Thanksgiving, but I will still be having a podcast episode released that day. I'll just be pre-recording it. But next week, we'll be talking about The Secret of Shadow Ranch, which is probably one of my favorites, and it's definitely one of the most loved Nancy Drew books in the Nancy Drew community. So don't worry, I got you covered. So The Mystery at Lilac Inn was probably one of the books that stood out the most to me as a kid. I don't know if it was just the cover, the overall plot. I really liked this book, and I felt like it was one of the better written books of the series, at least the early books, and so I was so excited to reread this one. So The Mystery at Lilac Inn was written in 1930, and it was the last book written for that year. It's pretty impressive, even despite Edward Stratemeyer passing away, that these first 4 books came out in the same year. Also, when I was Googling things about The Mystery at Lilac Inn, I found out that there's an actual real place called Lilac Inn, and it's in Vermont, and it looks amazing. It's like this beautiful little bed and breakfast, and now I kind of want to stay there. I mean, I probably won't encounter any ghosts or submarines or anything, but if I get some scones and breakfast in bed, I think I'll be good. Okay, so now on to discussing the covers for this book. And this book, the cover really captured my attention more as a kid than some of the others. Just the ghostly figure on the front, and I believe Nancy is in the bottom corner. She's the one wearing the darker wig, and she has the flashlights attached to the sleeves like they talk about in the book, but I always thought this cover was very cool. So, as always, the original 1930 cover was illustrated by Russell Tandy, but then I also found information on the updated covers, and the credits go to Bill Gillies and Rudy Nappy. Now, the original 1930s cover I had never actually seen, but we have Nancy. She's hiding behind a door and listening in on the bad guys, and you can see what I believe is Gay Moreau and some of the henchmen that she works with. And Nancy is wearing like a little beret. Her clothing is all blue, and she's holding her shoes because she apparently does not want to be overheard sneaking in to listen to them. So the second cover is very similar to the first. We have Nancy outside of a room and listening in on the bad guys, and we have Gay Moreau. Her back is to the viewer, and Nancy is looking sort of down and towards the corner. She's got that blonde waved hair and a cute little scalloped little top on, but I had never seen this cover either. The third edition of this cover for The Mystery at Lilac Inn is the one that I have most commonly seen, but you have all these lilac bushes in the foreground, and then you have this ghostly figure. It's Nancy's doppelganger, who is actually Gay Moreau, and then you have Nancy in the corner with the black wig on, and you can see Lilac Inn in the distance. It just looks like a dark and foggy night, and I always thought this looked so creepy to me as a kid, and reading this book, I feel like the villains in this book really stepped it up. I was afraid for Nancy at several points during this book. So I actually decided to give these covers a rating of 4 magnifying glasses, and I tend to actually favor the last cover that I mentioned, the revised edition, because that's what I grew up with as a kid, and I feel like it really captures some of the action. But I do like Russell Tandy's original cover as well. I just think the third cover really captures a lot more of the story. So I was trying to come up with a funny cover spoof for this book, and I kept failing. I kept just racking my brain, and I couldn't think of anything. So my husband actually gets credit for this one. So my husband came up with the spoof cover of, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you have any toilet paper?" Because they are kind of crouching in the bushes, and I think that's why he said that, but I thought it was hilarious. Ooh, the case of the occupied bathroom. It's never actually mentioned in any of these Nancy Drew books, but in the 1930s, like I'm assuming some people would have had indoor plumbing, like really well-off people like Nancy, but I'm sure a lot of these people had outhouses too. Okay, on to the main cast of characters. So Nancy's friend Helen Corning is in this book, Carson Drew, and there's also Emily Willoughby, and she is the woman who owns the Lilac Inn with her husband Dick. There's also mentioning of Miss Willoughby, who is Emily's mom, Maud Potter, who is the social director at the inn, and Mr. Daly, who I believe runs maintenance at the inn. Another key character is John McBride, who is a young man who is friends with Emily and Dick and becomes friends with Nancy and Helen. And there is a waitress mentioned named Jean Holmes, and then there is a villain of Gay Moreau and her henchmen. There's quite a cast of characters in this book, which may be another reason why I liked it so much. It's so interesting, but it was easy to keep track of who's who also. Now, I wrote down the most brief synopsis that I could come up with, but it's quite long because there's quite a few key plot points in this book, so be prepared. Nancy and Helen canoe to Lilac Inn to visit their friend Emily Willoughby, but not before their canoe rams something in the river and they go flying into the water. When they finally show up, Emily tells them the inn is haunted. A lilac tree was cut down and unexplained music has been playing, but before Nancy can solve much, Hannah Gruen calls her saying the house has been broken into. Nancy goes home and sees that her clothes and a picture of her have been stolen, and then she gets a call from a department store. Someone has been impersonating her and trying to buy things under her credit. Nancy also gets run off the road by a truck. Once back at Lilac Inn, Emily says they'll be having a dinner to celebrate her inherited diamonds. What could go wrong? The lights go out, and when they come back on, the diamonds are gone, and Nancy notices lilacs on the floor. She finds a secret passage that explains how the diamonds were taken. The next day, John McBride finds what he thinks are Emily's diamonds under a bush, but when they have them appraised, they're fake, leading Nancy to believe that the thief still has the real ones. Then Nancy gets invited to skin dive with John, but it's a setup. She sees what looks like a shark head underwater and a spear is thrown at her. Next, Nancy and Helen's cottage explodes and Helen is hit over the head. Nancy looks into the waitress, Mary Mason, who quit just before she arrived, and a rock is thrown at her car. Nancy is meanwhile also trying to find out the meaning of a note that references blue pipes or lilacs and decides to dress up like the ghostly apparition. She runs face to face into her impersonator, whom she had suspected might be involved in the hauntings, when she found her stolen charge plate in the dining room. Unfortunately, a guard the inn hired captures Nancy, but not the real ghost. Oh, and there's a man-made earthquake. Nancy begins to suspect Jean Holmes, a waitress, of trying to blame the inn's sabotage on Maud, the social director. She sees Jean sneaking out one night and follows her, only to get caught and put into a shark-shaped submarine. Jean is also Mary and Gay Moreau, who is enacting revenge because Carson Drew got her jail time for check forgery. The crew moves Nancy to a boat downriver, but it starts to sink. Luckily, the police show up and rescue Nancy, but confusion mounts because Gay, who was giving a villain's speech, had made herself look like Nancy just before the boat sank. Nancy helps her father realize Gay is a fake, the bad guys are arrested, and Nancy and John skin dive to recover the diamonds from the sunken boat. Okay, so if you're still with me after all that, I applaud you. There is so much stuff that goes on in this book. There's impersonators, there's check forgery, there's, villains enacting years worth of revenge, there's shark-shaped submarines and man-made earthquakes. Like, it's literally one of the craziest books, but it's so good. Also, again, what did I tell you? So many boat accidents because Nancy and Helen in the beginning, their canoe capsizes because they hit the submarine. They don't realize it's underneath them in the river because why would there be a shark-shaped submarine in a river? But then at the very end of the book, you have Nancy on the boat with the villains and it's sinking. Like, I don't know. I think somebody had a traumatic boat accident and they were ghostwriting for these books. Not only that, Nancy and Helen almost get killed when their cabin explodes. Luckily, they were out of it, but then Helen still gets hit over the head. Nancy almost gets run over by a truck. There are so many things in this book that the villains were out for them. It's crazy. And then a man-made earthquake. Like, how? What is happening? Like, these were written in the 1930s, which, there were some rumors that Tesla had a device that could do something like that, but still, it's beyond belief. I have to suspend my disbelief. I mean, we haven't even talked about the fact that Nancy's identity is stolen for half of this book, and there's impersonators, and it is crazy. Like, the book before the bungalow mystery, we had the Aborns, and they were being impersonated by Alma and Stumpy Dowd. Worst names ever. I'm sure there will be worse names, though, in this series. But they just basically assume their names. These impersonators, disguise themselves and make up these entire new personalities. It's wild. It makes a lot of sense, though, because Gay Moreau, the main villain, was wanting to be an actress. She was an aspiring actress before she got put in jail by Carson for check forgery of all things, which is crazy. She's been waiting years to enact her revenge on Carson, and so she decides to go after Nancy. It's brilliant. Okay, wow. So I haven't even gotten to the newspaper headline synopsis yet, but the one that I came up with was Local Inn Plagued by Disaster, Criminals Are Apprehended by Teen Girl. Of course, there would be no mentioning of the diamonds in this newspaper headline because for most of the book, Emily Willoughby just insists that Nancy not mention the diamonds to the police because she doesn't want to, quote unquote, hurt the reputation of the inn. Excuse me, you're having earthquakes, your cabin exploded, there's a submarine, there's people quitting their jobs right and left. I think that diamond theft is the least of your worries. Let me tell you, when I said that this book was a crazy ride, I enjoyed every minute of it because it kept me turning the pages and it wasn't dull to read at all. There were so many interesting plot points, but they actually went together because sometimes in Nancy Drew books, you'll have things that are just randomly thrown in and they don't make any sense. While some of these things were very weird and out there, it all made sense in the end, which I appreciated. So as always, I took some notes of things that I noticed while reading this book. At one point, it's mentioned that Nancy eats cream of chicken on toast, which sounds very bizarre to me because I was actually at the store today and I was in the soup aisle and I was looking at, cream of mushroom, cream of chicken, all the creams, and maybe not whipped cream, but it's weird to think about eating that on toast. Maybe eating it and then dipping toast in it, but it just says cream of chicken on toast. I don't know, it might be good. It kind of sounds like it might be kind of like chicken pot pie, but deconstructed. I don't know. Somebody eat it and tell me if it's any good. Now, the second note that I took down was that it's mentioned that there are 12 cottages outside of Lilac Inn. So I'm assuming that Emily and Dick, they live in the actual inn and then they have all these 12 little cottages that people can stay in. Well, that's a lot. That's plenty. They were kind of worried about making money, it sounded like, but I'm like, you have quite a few rooms. I mean, granted, you have one less now. You have 11 because Nancy and Helen's cottage blew up, but still. My next note says just charge plate, and this, I knew that it was probably the precursor to the credit card, but I looked it up and it was so interesting. It was just basically this little wooden or sometimes a variation of plastic card, and you would have your signature on the back. And so you would just show people this and they would take down your information if you were buying something at a store, and then you would get the bill sent to your home address, which is so weird. That seems, I don't know, it seems like you'd be chasing down your money a lot of times, which I guess back then people were more honest and they didn't have to worry about anything happening, but a charge plate, kind of cool. It was so messed up how Gay Moreau, the villain in this story, stole Nancy's charge plate, stole her clothing, and then stole a picture of her, and she just mimicked and was so good at impersonating Nancy that some of her own friends were like, oh yeah, I saw you just a few minutes ago. And Nancy was like, no, I wasn't there. I was all the way across town. My next note, it just says Maud asks about Nancy's dad. And so Maud is the social director at Lilac Inn, and she's definitely hitting up Nancy for information. And she said, oh yeah, I heard your dad's a widower. And Nancy just shuts that down immediately. I can't remember what she says, but it was like basically like, ain't gonna happen. So this next fact just kind of has to do with world history, which I found kind of interesting because sometimes when you pick up a Nancy Drew book, you don't expect to learn things about the world. But Romania, it says Rumania in these books, and looking it up, I didn't realize Romania was called Romania before 1975. So since these books were revised previous to that, that's why it says Romania. So I learned something. This next note probably doesn't mean anything, and I'm probably reading too much into it, but Dick, who is Emily's fiance, calls Nancy one of Emily's pretty bridesmaids. And I thought this was really weird and kind of creepy. I was just like, look, you're saying this in front of your future wife. Like, not cool. I guess he's also referring to Helen as a pretty bridesmaid because she's one of the bridesmaids, but still, like, just call them Emily's friends. Don't make it weird, Dick. Another weird thing about this book is that instead of calling it scuba diving, they just refer to it as skin diving, which I'm thinking is still just scuba diving because they say Nancy puts on her gear and her flippers and mask and everything, like a breathing apparatus. I think they call it an aqualung. So I'm like, why not just call it scuba diving? They call it skin diving and it sounds really risque and weird, but I'm pretty sure it's just scuba diving. I wish Harriet Stratmeyer Adams was still around so I could ask her. I'd be like, Harriet, what is skin diving? Can you please explain this to me? Is it just scuba diving? Did you just not know what it was called and you just made something up? Please, we all want to know. Now, throughout the course of this book, we have the character of John McBride, and he's the one that goes skin diving with Nancy, but he's like a secret agent operative guy, and so you can tell there's definitely some romantic implications there. You know, they like to hang out, they go skin diving, they eat breakfast together, whatever, but he's also helping Nancy solve this case. And at one point, John comes out in the middle of Nancy trying to lure the ghost, her impersonator. And so she's wearing a wig and she's dressed like the ghost. And John says the nicest thing, and it is, I much prefer the real Nancy. Is that not the sweetest thing that you have ever heard? It's probably the sweetest thing Nancy's heard up to this point because as far as her romantic relationships go, she had Dirk, who, you know, couldn't be kept waiting. And then she had Dawn, who she apparently didn't like very much. And she sent somebody else to go to a barbecue with him. So anyway, but don't get your hopes up too much because Nancy actually says at the very end that her steady partner is Mystery. Because Dick and Emily and several other people are joking like, oh, Nancy, when are you going to get married? Because, you know, they're getting married. Helen's been proposed to over the phone, you know, for those in the know. And Nancy is just over here solving mysteries. And so that to me just tells me that she's not looking for any kind of steady relationship anytime soon. And you know what? Good for her, because if she did get into serious of a relationship, she wouldn't be off solving mysteries and we wouldn't have the hundreds of books that we have. But there are, I'm not going to spoil anything, but some of the books that I've read later on, Nancy has quite a few relationships, so, and she has no problem solving mysteries. So my next note just says, who has money for a submarine? More specifically, a shark-shaped submarine, because I'm sure they're not cheap. And also, will somebody please tell me if they have the original version, because I do not. I have the revised. Was there a submarine in the original plot, or did Harriet just come up with this in the 50s or 60s because she was bored? Because I don't picture a submarine being easy to come by, one, and two, very cheap, because it was during the Depression. Who had money for a submarine? People barely had money for a car. It just goes to show how extra Gay Moreau was as a villain, because when she breaks out of jail after her check forgery, she's just like, you know what? I'm an actress. I have all this background in acting, so I'm going to impersonate all these people. I'm going to use my great makeup skills, and then I'm also going to just buy a shark-shaped submarine and an earthquake machine, because why not? I mean, you only live once, and if you're going to commit crimes, you should just do it in style, I guess. Disclaimer, you should not commit crimes, whether in style or not in style, because committing crimes is never in style. So for Nancy's add that to your resume section, I put expert skin diver. / scuba diver, because RIP, we cannot ask Harriet, but I'm assuming it's scuba diving. If it's not, I have so many questions. So I wrote down several things that I liked about this book and one very big thing that I didn't like, so we'll jump right into it. So for the first thing I liked about The Mystery at Lilac Inn, it was John McBride and Nancy's teamwork. So aside from skin diving, they helped find Emily's diamonds, they found that secret passageway, and they just really worked well together. And in previous books, Nancy has worked with Helen Corning, and she did work a little bit with her when she wasn't getting hit in the head. And I just really liked that. I liked Nancy teaming up with this guy. I also really liked all the spooky stuff, the explosions, seeing the shark head in the water, because, okay, if I was Nancy and I was underwater and I saw the shape of what looked like a shark, even if I'm in a river, I don't care. I've heard that it's actually pretty common that they can get into fresh water sometimes and get stuck. I'm gonna freak out, and I'm surprised that she didn't. And then she almost had that spear thrown at her, so the villains really upped the ante in this book. As for the final thing that I really, really liked about this book was Nancy's impersonator. That was a very cool aspect of this mystery, because Nancy is, the police come to her door and they're like, hey, you're under arrest because you've been stealing stuff, and she has to tell them, like, no, I was here the whole time. And so it's kind of scary that somebody could impersonate you so well that even your friends don't know that it wasn't you. Also, it was really creepy how when Nancy was on the boat with Gay and they're, speeding away with their diamonds and everything, they think they're going to get away with it. She starts putting on makeup and doing her hair like Nancy's, and she's impersonating her while she's giving this villain speech, and that would be pretty terrifying to see somebody just acting like you and pulling it off. Now, for the one thing that I didn't like about this book. So I just have the word Maud written down. I did not like Maud. For a social director, she was such a jerk. She was always just doing things to just cause problems, and she was always like poking at Nancy. Like when Nancy comes in after she gets caught by the guard and she's still dressed like the ghost that she was trying to catch, she's wearing this dark hair, and Maud makes this comment like, oh, are you done with the redhead life? You trying to see what it's like to be a brunette, Nancy? And then she also like hits on Nancy's dad, like trying to like feel Nancy out for information, and it's just, she's the worst. So yeah, Maud was my least favorite part about this book. Everything else I really, really liked, and upon reading it again, now I can see why I liked it so much as a kid. It kept my attention. It was full of action. While some of that action was kind of crazy and unbelievable, I loved every minute of it. So The Mystery at Lilac Inn gets 5 magnifying glasses from me. It was really cool. I loved this book, and it's honestly one of my favorites that I've read so far. I know that, Secret of the Old Clock and Hidden Staircase are also some really good books and fan favorites, but this is the book that really got me hooked as a kid, and I can definitely see why. So that is the conclusion of today's episode, and next week we've got episode 7, which is about The Secret at Shadow Ranch. So this is another good book, and you won't want to miss it. And even though it's Thanksgiving next week, I will be pre-recording, so you all won't have to miss an episode. I hope you all enjoyed and got a laugh out of this episode, because it was hilarious trying to record this and not laugh the entire time. So I guess I will see you all next week. Until then, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.